Good morning, Ruby Lane. Welcome back. We're going to have a little encore performance today. Today we're very fortunate to have a guest speaker, and this is Susan Foreman. She is a member of Carmel Doll and Toy Study Group, a member of, what's in the other club?
California Scenic Coast.
Right. Anyone who has read doll news for the last 20 years has read articles by Susan Foreman, and also Antique Doll Collector. She is one of our star speakers in our club.
God. Now I have to live up to this.
She's got to live up to it, yes.
Oh my goodness.
And we're really happy because this is such a timely program for this time of the year. And it also has balance of some of our other presentations we've done for Ruby Lane, which has been about the new Paris, the Paris of Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann. Now we're going to go on a journey to the old Paris of Montmartre. The presentation is Poulbot, artist, humanitarian. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan to explain this extraordinary man and his influence on really the 20th century.
He truly is. He's just wonderful. First of all, hello Ruby Lane. It's nice to be with you. And I'm so fortunate I can speak about a man that I so admire. And at this time of the year, he truly conveys the Christmas spirit of giving, and just his kindness really shows through the dolls. And partly what I love is when you collect anything, is to learn more about that object. What created it? What was the society like that made it possible? What was the economy? And who was the person behind it? And it all for me started because I purchased this set of dolls made by SFBJ in 1914. And I knew they were called Poulbots, but I did not know anything about Poulbot. And that started this whole quest. And this has been just a continual, I've got so much information on him, so I will try to narrow it down. Francis Poulbot was born in 1879 in Saint Denis, France, which is just outside of Paris. His parents were both educators. He was the oldest of 5 children, and his parents had always hoped that he would follow in their footsteps. However, education was not his forte. He, in fact, was known in school to be doing mostly caricatures of his teachers, which the fellow students found very humorous, the teachers not so. But even at the age of about 15, he submitted a cartoon to a magazine, and it was purchased. So he kind of knew that this is where his life would lead, is into art. And whenever he could, because where he grew up was fairly close to the Montmartre, which was a center for artists, and just, you know, it was such a lively part of Paris.
And Susan, that's really the old Paris.
It is truly the old Paris.
Never destroyed.
And exactly. And they always were like their own selves. They did not want to be a part of Paris. They were the Montmartre. And he would escape there whenever he could. And during one little escapade, he discovered Toulouse-Lautrec. And at that point, he said, okay, this is where I belong. This is what I'm going to do with my life. And so in 1902, he finally packed his meager belongings and moved to the Montmartre. Being a struggling artist, meaning he was broke, he ended up living in the absolute poorest section of the Montmartre. It was also home, in addition to starving artists, to the street urchins. And his heart went out to these street urchins. This is a photo, in fact, of, I don't know if you can see it, but this is what the Montmartre looked like when he moved there in 1902. So it was really quite dilapidated. He called his home the garlic box because it had so many holes in the wall that you could smell what the neighbors were cooking, and it was not always pleasant. He also discovered that it was also home to the street urchins. And this is a photo of the real Parisian street urchins. They were just merely the poor children that played in the streets of the Montmartre. But his heart truly went out to them. and I have the description he wrote of the Poulbots. Here's how his quote. He said, "The ones I see from my window are happy and carefree, and a bit perverse, touching little thieves, both cruel and adorable. They use violent language, energetic, brutal, with a love for dirty words. They are modern kids." Now remember, this is 1902. "They fight and make up, yell and sing louder than any noise in Paris. They skip from street to sidewalk, dodge passers-by, and disappear into side alleys, ringing doorbells and yelling in the hallways, free as the air, the seats of their pants worn from sliding down Montmartre's banisters." So those were the kids. And throughout his life, he would continue to help the kids. And for example, Christmas was a special part of his life. But he would depict the poor children that didn't have much at Christmas.
And would he do this through his illustrations? So he eventually became a working illustrator, an artist?
He was an artist prior to that. He did a lot of commercial art. He did advertisements for various companies. He did illustrations for newspapers.
So he was able to make a living.
He was making a living. He was not famous yet. That was to come in 1911. However, this was, I think, an excellent magazine. This is from 1906, December. And virtually what it is saying, it's showing this poor child, and here's some wealthy children that just received their Christmas gifts. And the translation is, the wealthy kids are saying, "You got nothing," and the poor little girls, the poor child said, "Yes, I got another brother." And so most of them were just huge families, and they didn't have much. And that was what he depicted, but he did it in such a sweet way.
Yeah.
So in any event, that was around 1906. In 1908, actually it was 1907, there was an organization that started that was a group of illustrators and artists from France, or from Paris. And he was one of the instigators. It was called the Humoristes des Salons. And one of the first shows they did in 1908 was to feature illustrations, sculpture. So Poulbot did 18 dolls. Ironically, these are the pictures of the dolls. They were of like a composition material depicting street kids. And now he, of course, was not known as a doll maker. What I find really interesting is this took place 3 weeks prior to the Munich Art Fair.
Oh, wow.
Art dolls. And so you think of Marion Cowlitz and those dolls, very similar. They were, at the Munich, they were depicting street children. They had to be made of a composition type material and by artists that were not known as doll makers. So that would be an interesting thing to research, is what is their connection? I mean, because it's the fact that it was within 3 weeks of each other.
Do you think it was just in the culture?
I think it was the culture. I think it comes back to society at that time was becoming more aware of things were changing, and it no longer the pretty little French doll or what have you, or
the Victorian age is ending.
And I think that was a lot of it, because then the character dolls came in. So of these 18 dolls, in 1987, I believe it was, there were 6 dolls that had been tracked down that were still with the heirs of the Poulbot family. In 93, 6 dolls were sold at auction. I'm presuming those are the same 6 dolls. The other 12, you know, look at an addict. One doesn't know. Of course, there was the war. Things could have gotten destroyed. But as far as the whereabouts, we don't know where the rest of the dolls are. But that was his first kind of introduction into doll making. At this point, his name was not well known in Paris, except with his illustrations. However, in 1911, he did and I'm sorry, Ruby Lane, I have to share
naughty.
this. Is this okay to share? This is what put his name in the forefront
Viewer
of Paris.
discretion is advised.
Exactly. This cartoon that he did is called The First Cigarette. And it created quite an uproar because, as you see, it's a young boy lighting a cigarette, and the little girl is shielding him with her upturned skirt, and apparently there's no underwear.
Well, that's very French.
It's so French. However, even the French were not happy about this. So the Parisians got together, sued him for indecency. Well, the Montmartre, of course, said, you are not going to pick on one of our people. And they got together, and finally the lawsuit was dropped. I think the populace of the Montmartre had their way, and they didn't want to deal with them after that. However, from that point on, Poulbot's name was well known. And so that was in 1911. And then I actually made a couple of notes because sometimes I get so distracted. Then we're going up to, around 1913. And he had done the dolls in 1908. So he sculpted a couple of dolls for SFBJ to produce. And that's what started my whole quest on Poulbot. So these were designed by Poulbot. That's mold 239. The back of the head does have Poulbot's signature on it with the 239.
And he did do the sculpture.
He did do the sculpture for these. And the little boy is named Ninette, which, yes, is a kind of a female nickname, but that was what his wife called him, as Ninette. He in turn called her Rin Tin Tin. So that was her nickname. So the boy still has his tag. And so this is Rin Tin Tin and this is Ninette. And this is their original box. Now, in 1914, in 5 of the department stores, trends catalogs, they did feature these dolls. This is a picture from one of them showing them. And one of the reasons that Poulbot created these dolls was really so that the children didn't have to continue to buy German bland smiley face dolls, to quote Poulbot, and also to bring attention to the street urchins of the Montmartre. As an interesting aside, just for curiosity this morning, I looked in a dictionary for the word Poulbot as a noun, and it says urchin. Because from 1906 on, Poulbot's love for these children and the way he displayed them and used them in the illustrations, they became known as Poulbots, and to this day, they are still called Poulbots.
Awesome.
So his impact has been incredible.
Susan, did his wife design the clothing for the dolls?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so. I hadn't read that. They had just gotten married, actually, the year in 1914. When these dolls came out is when they got married.
And I should say to the Ruby Lane audience, because these dolls do come up on Ruby Lane and other sources, but they don't always have the original clothes. So this is a good time to really get in and freeze your computer screen to see how they really should be dressed.
I remember one article where they had them both dressed as little girls, and I just thought, oh, it's like putting Max and Moritz, as girls.
And that's happened.
I have, oh yes, and that doesn't sit well either. So anyway, sadly, these dolls, either they didn't meet with, rave reviews with the children because they are very realistic, but also World War I came along, and I think that had a huge impact, which is the reason that these only were on the market for the 1 year. And then all of a sudden we had the war. And now Poulbot at that time, he was very much the patriotic Frenchman, and he did attempt to enlist. Unfortunately, because of a bone disease, he was not able to go to war, in combat, but he was able to fight through his pen. And he started doing some incredible, extremely patriotic, to the French postcards, books. He illustrated posters. One of my favorites I absolutely love this one. I don't know if you can get a picture, but it shows a little child and a boat is sinking, and there's a Lusitania life preserver around him, and it translates to "Mama, Mama, why?"
And
this
Lusitania is really
1915.
the catalyst that got
That-
America really involved.
Exactly.
The inhumanity of that
Exactly.
sinking.
And so virtually, most of his illustrations will depict the children, the Poulbots, virtually going to war in a sense, but in their childlike way. They would be carrying a broom that was supposed to be a rifle, but he definitely got his message across. At the same time, during the war effort, there came into being these little fetishes, if you will. And this is an example of a little yarn fetish. And these, in turn, the little one was called Nanette, and then the little girl one was Rin Tin Tin, after the nicknames of Poulbot. Now, the real origin of these fetishes, which were actually made by the Parisian women out of yarn and given as good luck charms and to children, to the soldiers as they went to war to protect them. The story as to how it's related to Poulbot has yet to really been verified, but the story goes that Mr. and Mrs. Poulbot did create little yarn dolls that they gave to the children of the Montmartre, and they in turn named them after Mr. and Mrs. Poulbot. That's the story. In any event, soldiers, as you mentioned, Michael, about the Americans, about the Yankees getting involved, when the soldiers arrived, they were given fetishes as good luck charms. And to show the impact of Poulbot on the world, one particular aviator, Lee Duncan, upon his return to the United States, brought two dogs that had served in the Army. He brought them home, the German Shepherds, and one he named Nanette because he had received these fetishes. The other was Rin Tin Tin. Sadly, Nanette died of pneumonia shortly after arriving in the United States, but as we all know, Rin Tin Tin went on to great fame as a Hollywood movie star, and he is indeed buried in Paris.
And this is Rin Tin Tin.
And this is Rin Tin Tin up here. And he was named after the Poulbot fetishes, which I just think is amazing. It shows the impact that Poulbot had. So that was virtually during the war years. They did come back or reissue the fetishes in World War II, and Tafari did some brooches and that sort of thing. So they continue to have an impact.
Susan, these little characters here, tell us about these.
Okay, I was just getting up to that. So we got through the war years, and before I get to these, because these are about 1925, so just prior to that, Poulbot did design some other dolls, and they were out of cloth, and these are called the Poulbots. They do come with the tag that has the doll's name and Poulbot's signature. So the little girl was Zozo, and Zozo was the adopted child of the Poulbots, because Mr. and Mrs. Poulbot did not have their own children. So that was in the early 20s. Then in 1925, DeCamp came out with some mechanical dolls, of which these are examples. And this is Toto, this is Tata, and this is Fifi. Now, I don't know that these were designed by Poulbot, but they are called Poulbots. And as I mentioned, Poulbot became the name that everyone used for street urchins. And so, I don't know if he'll work on the... They like to have a flat surface, and so he may not stand up too well. But you can see they just rock back and forth.
So these were done in the 1925. Do you
Uh-huh.
think that now they're looking a little more healthy? Did the did it improve for the Poulbots? Living conditions?
It did, and part of what accounted for that was in 1922, Poulbot decided to establish an organization called the Republic of the Montmartre. And because remember I said he is such a kind person, that means everybody loved him. So when he wanted something done, his friends all said, sure, we'll help, And so he was able to put together an organization. He built a medical clinic for the children. He had doctors, nurses, dentists provide their services free of charge. Shopkeepers provided food, clothing to help these poor children. So
most of them probably at this period were war orphans?
They were, yes. I mean, they were poor before, but it was really poor afterwards, and a lot of them without family and all. But he did require of the children that if you're going to partake of this, you need to remember to be good to others. You have to be clean and orderly. And so he had these certain commandments of the children. And I had read excerpts from different articles where one man who was a restaurateur and became quite well known in Paris attributed it to Poulbot, that he would have gone the way of the streets had it not been for the Republic of the Montmartre. Well, Poulbot realized that these children, a lot of them did not have Christmas because they were poor. So he decided in 1922 he was going to have a Christmas party. And so he got the Moulin Rouge to provide the venue. He had people within the Montmartre all got together and provided food, gifts. They decorated the Moulin Rouge, beautifully, and invited all the children. 2,000 children showed up.
Wow.
And Poulbot played Father Christmas. Not one child left without a gift. The little girls got dolls. The little boys got, wooden trains. And this went on for many years, up until 1933, when the clinic and when it was the organization ceased, because by then they had more social services, and there was a depression. But he continued to play Father Christmas, and he had his bone disease. Towards the end, he was in a wheelchair, but he still dressed up as Father Christmas. And it just kept growing every year, so it's amazing.
Would you tell our audience about the World War II era, because that's where he really became an incredible hero.
Well, during World War II, and there's other things he did, but before I get into the World War II, just prior to that, he also, because of his influence with the people, and he lived in the Montmartre his whole life. He did move out of the garlic box eventually and had a nice home built, but in late 30s, there was a organization called the League Against Slums, and he started doing postcards and all to help promote funds to help with the slum situation. Another incident he did, there was a square in Montmartre that was a beautiful park-like atmosphere, and some developers were going to come in and build high-rise homes there, apartments. Well, the citizenry of the Montmartre said, no way, we're not doing that. And so they band together, and within 48 hours, they had converted this into a playground. They had gardens, they had a Punch and Judy set up, they had music, they had swings, and publicized it throughout Paris about what they had achieved. Well, by then the developers said, oh, no way, we can't compete with this. They backed out. So Poulbot said, well, this is a one-shot deal. We can't have this happen again. So he suggested having a vineyard planted. They planted the vineyard, grew the grapes, sold the wine, and the wine helped to benefit the poor. That vineyard is still in business. Every October you can go and you can buy wine, which will then in turn help the poor.
Wow.
So that organization is still going on. Now, as far as World War II goes, he the Germans did not forget what he did.
Should we show the audience him?
Oh, I didn't even think to. Yes,
Show him.
that is.
And that's about that time period, isn't it, or close?
That would be probably about that time period. Yeah, that was when he was probably, in his late 50s, 60-ish, because he did die shortly after that. But the Germans did not forget what he had what he thought about the Germans
From World War I.
From World War I. So they put him under house arrest, and he was told that he could not show any of his art or do any illustrations for anything. I mean, so he was pretty much stuck. But finally, when the war ended, he did do his first cartoon, showed a little boy in a classroom with a dunce cap, and the teacher saying to him, "Okay, Poulbot, your punishment is over. You can come out of the corner." And so that was, and he, the people. He just did so much for so many, and the fact that it's still his inspiration is still there today. Sadly, he did die in 1946, so he wasn't that old, but he accomplished so much. And to this day, there's still organizations raising funds for the Poulbots. And then he had an influence on Michael Thomas, who was a artist in the 60s that did the Big Eye kids. And he did postcards, and he was all inspired by Poulbot, and his cards, most of them depict Poulbots. Then there was Leah Steen that does brooches. In fact, I'm wearing mine right now. This is a Poulbot. And she was one of the first to actually use plastic for brooches. And she started doing that in the 40s. She and her husband did a lot of research, and she did a way of layering it and putting brocades or different textiles within the plastic and fusing it. So she did a whole series called the Poulbot Kids. I have a little girl as well, of course, because, but in any event, I just think that it's...
I mean, it's an amazing thing when you think of an illustrator, artist, doll maker that has been so impactful on the world.
On the world.
To have your name in a dictionary.
Well, that's it, and it's a noun. I mean, it's now... Yeah, they are Poulbots. It's a beautiful
Well, I think we
story.
should take, before we say goodbye and Merry Christmas, we should take one more look at the Poulbots.
I just love them. I really do.
And thank you, Susan, for giving us this wonderful program. You're always so insightful and have some exciting thing to teach us.
And I never know what I'm going to say. It's always a surprise for all of us.
Bye-bye, Ruby Lane. Thank you.
Bye, Ruby Lane.
Bye-bye.